Sometimes standing up for what's right costs you everything you've ever known. Eleanor learned this truth at 53 when she refused to lie to her students and lost her teaching position, her home, and her future in a single day. Now, she walks alone through the frozen woods of Surnen, carrying only her books and the weight of exile. Winter is closing in fast, and she knows these woods hold dangers far worse than cold and hunger. But when ancient footsteps follow her trail and glowing eyes watch from the shadows, Eleanor discovers that not all monsters are what they seem. Tharion has wandered these forests for over 1,000 years, an outcast vampire who refuses to harm the innocent. Two lonely souls, both rejected by their worlds, are about to find an impossible refuge in each other. Can a mortal teacher's heart truly trust an immortal predator? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning Eleanor Whitmore lost, everything began like any other in the village of Millbrook. She had risen before dawn, as was her custom for the past 15 years, to prepare lessons for the 37 children who filled her modest schoolhouse. At 53, Eleanor carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had found her calling later in life. Her silver-streaked auburn hair was always neatly braided, her simple brown dress pressed and mended with careful stitches, and her green eyes held the particular warmth that comes from a life spent nurturing young minds. The leather-bound book she clutched against her chest as she fled through the snow had been her grandfather's, a true account of Surnen's history that contradicted everything King Aldric's scribes had written in recent years. Within its worn pages lay stories of brave rebels, honest merchants, and fair-minded rulers who had once made their kingdom a place of learning and justice. These were the truths Eleanor had dared to teach her students instead of the sanitized lies the crown demanded. Eleanor's path to teaching had not been conventional. Born to a family of modest means, she had educated herself through sheer determination and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. She had spent her 20s and 30s working as a governess for wealthy families, saving every coin to build a small library of her own. When the previous schoolmaster in Millbrook had died, Eleanor had arrived with her books and her passion, transforming what had been a dreary recitation hall into a place where children asked questions and discovered wonder in learning. For 15 years, she had taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history to generations of village children. She knew every family, every story, every dream harbored within Millbrook's borders. She had watched babies become scholars, seen shy children find their voices, and helped countless young people discover their own capacity for greatness. Her students were not just pupils, they were the future she had helped to shape with patience, kindness, and unwavering commitment to truth. But King Aldric's reign had grown increasingly oppressive in recent years. What had begun as minor revisions to textbooks had evolved into wholesale rewrites of history. The king's version of events painted him as a generous ruler whose father had saved the kingdom from chaos, when Eleanor knew the truth was far different. The previous king had been a tyrant whose heavy taxes and cruel laws had driven many families to ruin. Aldric's grandfather had indeed restored order, but through wisdom and justice, not through the iron fist that current propaganda claimed. When the royal inspector had arrived 3 weeks ago with new curriculum requirements, Eleanor had listened with growing horror. She was to teach that the common people had begged for stricter laws, that increased taxes were a privilege rather than a burden, and that anyone who questioned the crown's wisdom was inherently treasonous. She was to burn her grandfather's history book and replace it with approved texts that painted dissent as madness and submission as virtue. Eleanor had smiled politely, accepted the new materials, and then proceeded to teach exactly as she always had. She showed her students how to think critically, how to question what they were told, and how to seek truth, even when it was uncomfortable. When little Thomas had asked why the new books contradicted everything they had learned before, Eleanor had gently explained that sometimes people in power tried to change history to make themselves look better. The inspector's return visit had been swift and merciless. Eleanor was branded a corrupting influence, stripped of her position, and ordered to leave Millbrook by sunset. The village elders, terrified of royal retribution, had offered no support. Parents, who had once praised her dedication, now avoided her gaze. Children who had loved her were forbidden to say goodbye. And so Eleanor found herself walking through the ancient forest of whispers as darkness fell on the shortest day of winter. The kingdom of Surnen stretched vast and unforgiving around these woods, but King Aldric's reach extended to every village, every farmstead, every place where ordinary people might offer shelter to a disgraced teacher. The forest was her only option, a place so feared that even the king's men rarely ventured into its depths. Snow crunched beneath Eleanor's worn boots as she picked her way between towering pine trees that seemed to swallow what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Her breath formed silver clouds in the frigid air, and her fingers ached despite her woolen gloves. She carried a simple canvas bag containing her most precious books, a few days' worth of bread and cheese, and the small amount of coin she had managed to save over the years. It was woefully inadequate for survival in the wilderness, but it was all she possessed. The Forest of Whispers earned its name from the way wind moved through its ancient trees, creating sounds that seemed almost like voices calling from the depths. Local legends spoke of creatures that walked upright but were not human, of lights that danced between the trees to lead travelers astray, and of ruins from an older time when different laws governed the land. Most dismissed such tales as superstition, but Eleanor had always been drawn to stories that others discarded too quickly. As she walked deeper into the forest, Eleanor found herself thinking about her students. Young Margaret, who had just learned to read and devoured every book Eleanor could find for her. Samuel, whose stutter disappeared when he recited poetry. Little Anna, who drew beautiful maps of imaginary kingdoms where everyone was treated fairly. Would they remember what she had taught them about thinking for themselves? Or would fear and new teachers eventually erase those lessons? The temperature continued to drop as night deepened. Eleanor's simple cloak, adequate for village life, provided little protection against the forest's bitter cold. She had hoped to find some kind of shelter, a cave, an abandoned woodcutter's hut, anything that might shield her from the wind that cut through the trees like knives. But the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, and her legs grew heavier with each step. It was then that Eleanor first felt the sensation of being watched. Not the casual observation of forest creatures startled by an intruder, but the focused attention of intelligence. She paused beside a massive oak tree, pressing her back against its rough bark as she scanned the shadows between the trees. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to breathe slowly and listen carefully. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No wind stirred the branches overhead. No small animals rustled through the underbrush. Even her own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened around her. Eleanor clutched her grandfather's book tighter and took a tentative step forward. That was when she saw the eyes. They gleamed like amber caught in candlelight, watching her from perhaps 20 paces away. Too high off the ground to belong to a wolf, too steady and intelligent to be any ordinary forest creature. Eleanor stood perfectly still, understanding instinctively that running would be futile. Whatever watched her moved with the fluid grace of a predator, and she was already exhausted from her journey. "I mean no harm to your domain," she called out softly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I'm only seeking shelter for the night." The eyes blinked once, slowly, and then disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. Eleanor waited for several heartbeats, but the forest remained silent and still. When she finally convinced herself to move, again she discovered something that made her breath catch in her throat. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, warm golden light flickered like firelight through windows. Eleanor approached cautiously, half convinced she was seeing things from cold and exhaustion. But as she drew closer, the outline of a structure became unmistakable, a fortress of dark stone that seemed to grow from the forest floor itself, its towers reaching toward the star-scattered sky. The building was ancient, that much was clear from its weathered walls and the way moss had claimed portions of its foundation, yet it was not the ruin she might have expected to find in these forgotten woods. Light glowed from several windows, smoke rose from chimneys, and the massive wooden doors stood slightly ajar, as if welcoming weary travelers. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the fortress's courtyard, every instinct warning her that accepting shelter from unknown inhabitants might be more dangerous than freezing to death in the forest. But her body had reached its limits, and the cold was beginning to affect her judgment. Her fingers had lost sensation despite her gloves, and her legs trembled with each step. As if summoned by her need, a figure emerged from the fortress's entrance. Eleanor's first impression was of unusual height, and the kind of graceful movement that suggested both strength and restraint. The man, for it was clearly a man despite the darkness, approached her with careful steps, as if afraid of startling a wounded animal. "You're far from any traveled path," he said, and his voice carried an accent Eleanor couldn't place, along with something else, an odd formality that suggested either great education or great age. "These woods are dangerous for mortals, especially on nights like this." Eleanor straightened despite her exhaustion, drawing on reserves of dignity she had cultivated through decades of facing skeptical parents and hostile administrators. "I'm quite aware of the risks," she replied, "but I'm afraid I have few alternatives at present." The stranger stepped closer, and moonlight revealed features that were both aristocratic and kind: high cheekbones, dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and those same amber eyes she had glimpsed between the trees. He was perhaps a decade older than Eleanor, though something about his bearing suggested he had seen far more than his apparent years might indicate. "My name is Tharion," he said with a slight bow that belonged to an earlier era. "This fortress has stood empty of guests for far too long. Would you honor me by accepting shelter until the weather improves?" Eleanor studied his face, searching for signs of deception or ill intent. What she found instead was a deep weariness that echoed her own, along with genuine concern for her well-being. It occurred to her that this man, whatever his secrets might be, understood something about exile and loneliness. "I'm Eleanor Whitmore," she replied, offering her own small curtsy, "and I would be most grateful for shelter, though I should warn you that my presence might bring unwelcome attention from the king's men." Tharion's expression darkened slightly. "King Aldrich's reach does not extend into these woods," he said with quiet certainty. "You will be safe here for as long as you wish to remain." As Eleanor followed Tharion across the courtyard toward the fortress's welcoming lights, she felt the weight of her grandfather's book against her chest and wondered what new chapter of her life was about to begin. Behind them, the forest of whispers seemed to exhale softly, as if the ancient trees themselves approved of this meeting between two souls who had lost their place in the ordinary world. Eleanor's legs gave way the moment she crossed the threshold of Tharion's fortress. The warmth that greeted her real heat from actual fires, rather than the phantom comfort her imagination had conjured, proved too much for the body that had been running on determination alone. She felt herself falling, her grandfather's book slipping from numb fingers, and then strong arms caught her before she could hit the stone floor. "Easy now," Tharion murmured, his voice closer than she had expected. "You're safe. Let me help you." Through the haze of exhaustion and relief, Eleanor became aware of several things at once. Tharion lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all, which seemed impossible given that she was not a small woman. His touch was gentle but confident, the way a parent might carry a sleeping child. And despite having just emerged from the winter forest, he was perfectly warm, not the gradual warmth of someone who had been near a fire, but an even, steady heat that seemed to radiate from his very being. The great hall Tharion carried her through was magnificent in a way that spoke of ancient wealth and careful preservation. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes and heraldic symbols covered the walls, their colors still rich despite obvious age. A massive fireplace dominated one end of the room, filled with logs that burned with unusual steadiness. Eleanor noticed carved stone details that suggested master craftsmanship from an era when such skills were more common. "How long have you lived here?" she asked weakly, as Tharion climbed a curved staircase toward what appeared to be guest chambers. "Longer than you might expect," he replied carefully. "This place has been my home through many changes in the world outside." He settled her in a chamber that was clearly prepared for visitors. The bed was made with fresh linens, a fire crackled in a smaller hearth, and thick curtains blocked any hint of winter wind. Eleanor sank into a chair beside the fire, finally allowing herself to acknowledge how close she had come to dying in the forest. "Thank you," she said simply. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me. The forest has a way of bringing together those two months who need each other," Tharion replied, and something in his tone suggested he spoke from experience. "Rest now. There will be time for questions tomorrow." But as he turned to leave, Eleanor noticed something that made her heart skip. On a small table near the door sat an ornate chalice, silver worked with intricate patterns and set with stones that caught the firelight. What drew her attention was not its obvious value, but the fact that it contained what appeared to be blood-dark, thick liquid that was unmistakably not wine. Tharion followed her gaze and went very still. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Eleanor felt her mind working through possibilities, discarding the most reasonable explanations as her scholarly instincts engaged with the evidence before her. "You're not entirely human, are you?" she said quietly. Tharion's shoulders tensed, and Eleanor saw his hands clench briefly before he forced them to relax. When he turned back to face her, his amber eyes held, a mix of resignation and something that might have been relief. "No," he said simply, "I am not." Eleanor studied his face, noting details she had missed in her exhausted state. His skin was too pale and too perfect, unmarked by the small scars and imperfections that accumulated over a normal human lifetime. His movements possessed an inhuman grace, and now that she was paying attention, she realized he cast no shadow despite standing directly in the firelight. "Vampire," she said, the word falling into the warm chamber like a stone dropped into still water. "Yes." Tharion moved slowly to a chair across from hers, sitting with careful precision, as if afraid any sudden movement might terrify her. "I understand if you wish to leave immediately. I can provide you with supplies and directions to—" "How long?" Eleanor interrupted. Tharion blinked, clearly not expecting that question. "How long have I been what I am?" "Yes, over 1,000 years." He watched her face carefully. As he spoke, "I was changed during the reign of King Marcus the Just, Aldric's great-grandfather. I have seen this kingdom rise and fall and rise again through 37 different rulers." Eleanor absorbed this information with the same methodical approach she had once used to evaluate historical documents. "And the chalice?" "I feed only on the willing," Tharion said firmly. "Merchants, travelers, those who understand what I am and choose to help sustain me in exchange for protection or knowledge. I take only what is freely given, and never enough to cause harm." "That's why you were exiled from your own kind," Eleanor said, pieces falling into place. "You refused to hunt innocents." Tharion's expression shifted to surprise. "How did you carry yourself like someone who once held authority but lost it through principle rather than failure," Eleanor explained. "I've seen that particular form of loneliness before. It's the burden of those who choose conscience over convenience." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each studying the other with new understanding. Eleanor found herself oddly unafraid. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the recognition of a kindred spirit, But Tharion's supernatural nature felt less important than the careful restraint she saw in his every movement. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. "Because you reminded me of someone I knew long ago," Tharion replied. "A teacher who refused to compromise her principles even when it cost her everything. She died defending the truth. And I—" He paused, his voice growing heavy with old pain. "I was not there to protect her when she needed it most. What was her name?" "Lyanna. She taught the children of nobles, back when education was considered a privilege rather than a tool for control. When the old king decided that questioning authority was dangerous, she was among the first to be silenced." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. "Lyanna Whitmore." Tharion's head snapped up, amber eyes wide with shock. "You know that name?" "She was my ancestor," Eleanor said slowly. "My great-great-grandmother. Family stories said she died defending her students, but I never knew the details." The chalice on the table seemed to gleam brighter in the firelight as the weight of connection settled between them. Eleanor understood now why Tharion had been watching her in the forest, why he had offered shelter without question. She represented an unfinished obligation, a debt of honor that had waited generations to be repaid. "I failed her," Tharion said quietly. "I was away on what I thought was urgent business when the king's men came for her. By the time I returned, she was already dead, and her students had been scattered to families who would never speak of what she had taught them." "She would not blame you for that," Eleanor said with certainty. "If she was anything like what family stories suggest, she would have understood that some duties cannot wait, even when the cost is terrible." Tharion looked at her with something approaching wonder. "You speak of her as if you knew her personally." "In a way, I did. Every time I chose truth over safety in my classroom, every time I helped a child learn to think rather than simply obey, I was continuing her work." Eleanor reached for her grandfather's book, which Tharion had carefully placed on the table beside her chair. "This contains her writings, along with those of others who believed that knowledge should serve truth rather than power." "Then you understand why I cannot let you face the same fate she did," Tharion said, leaning forward in his chair. "The patterns repeat themselves, Eleanor. Different kings, different times, but the same willingness to destroy those who refuse to bow. And you believe I'm safer here, sheltering with a vampire, than I would be trying to find my place in the mortal world again?" "I believe," Tharion said carefully, "that the mortal world has made its opinion of you quite clear. Here, at least, you would be valued for exactly what you are, a woman of learning and principle who refuses to compromise her integrity." Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she had carried for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to be without it. For the first time since the inspector had arrived in Millbrook, she was speaking with someone who understood not just her situation, but her choices. "How long would you be willing to shelter a difficult guest?" she asked. Tharion's smile was the first genuinely warm expression she had seen from him. "I was thinking we might start with winter and see how we both feel when spring arrives." As Eleanor settled back in her chair, she noticed that the chalice on the table no longer seemed ominous. Instead, it struck her as a symbol of the careful restraint that defined the man who had offered her sanctuary. She was sharing shelter with a creature of immense power who chose to limit himself by conscience rather than law. Outside, wind howled through the forest of whispers, but Eleanor felt warm and safe for the first time in weeks. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult questions, but tonight she could rest in the company of someone who understood the price of standing by one's principles. The last thing she remembered before exhaustion finally claimed her was the sound of Tharion moving quietly around the chamber, banking the fire and ensuring her comfort with the careful attention of someone who had long experience caring for others. Eleanor woke to the sound of winter wind against ancient stone and the unfamiliar comfort of a bed that had been warmed by banked coals. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, creating patterns on the floor that suggested she had slept far later than usual. Her first coherent thought was surprise that she felt rested rather than terrified. Apparently, her mind had made peace with sheltering alongside a vampire while she slept. The small writing slate she had carried during her flight from Millbrook lay on the bedside table where she had left it. The simple piece of wood and chalk had been her constant companion for 15 years of teaching, and seeing it in this ancient chamber felt like bringing two different worlds into collision. Eleanor dressed quickly in the same simple brown dress she had worn for her escape, made neat what repairs she could, and ventured out to explore her temporary home. Tharion's fortress revealed itself to be far larger than she had imagined in the darkness. Corridors branched off in multiple directions, leading to chambers that spoke of centuries of careful preservation. Eleanor found herself drawn to a library that took her breath away, walls lined floor to ceiling with books, scrolls, and manuscripts that represented knowledge gathered across ages. "Good morning, Tharions." The voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him standing in the doorway with the particular stillness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of his nature. "This collection is extraordinary," Eleanor said, gesturing toward the shelves around them. "Some of these texts, are they original manuscripts?" "Many are. When one has unlimited time, the accumulation of knowledge becomes both necessity and pleasure." Tharion moved into the room with careful grace. "You're welcome to read anything that interests you." Eleanor approached a shelf containing what appeared to be historical chronicles, her scholar's instincts immediately engaged. "These accounts of King Marcus's reign, I've never seen such detailed records. The official histories skip over most of his administrative policies. Marcus was a thoughtful ruler who believed in documenting his decisions for future generations," Tharion replied. "I had the privilege of serving in his court before my transformation. These are the records he wanted preserved, regardless of how they might reflect on his legacy." "You knew him personally." "It was not a question." Eleanor was beginning to understand the vast scope of experiences contained within Tharion's seemingly ordinary appearance. "I was captain of his personal guard for nearly a decade. Marcus treated his soldiers more like advisors than servants. He valued diverse perspectives on the challenges facing the kingdom." Tharion's expression grew distant with memory. "When I was changed, he could have ordered my destruction. Instead, he helped me understand what I had become and charged me with protecting knowledge and innocence wherever I found them." Eleanor pulled a chronicle from the shelf and opened it carefully. The writing was in Tharion's hand, though the ink had faded to brown with age. "You wrote these yourself." Marcus insisted that those who lived through events should record them honestly. He said, "Future rulers would need truth, rather than flattery, if they hoped to make wise decisions." Reading over the careful script, Eleanor found herself transported to an era when kings sought counsel rather than merely compliance. The entries described policy discussions, debates over taxation, and careful consideration of how laws would affect different groups within the kingdom. It was the kind of governance she had dreamed of seeing in her own lifetime. "This is what I tried to teach my students," she said softly. "That leadership should serve the people rather than the other way around. And it cost you everything, just as it cost others before you." Tharion moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could sense the controlled power in his still form. "Perhaps while you're here, you could help me update these records with more recent events. I've observed much over the past decades, but I lack your perspective on how current policies affect common families." Eleanor felt something that might have been excitement stir in her chest. The prospect of contributing to a true historical record, one that prioritized accuracy over political convenience, appealed to every instinct she possessed as both scholar and teacher. "I would be honored to help," she said, "though I should warn you that my observations will not reflect favorably on King Aldrich's methods. Truth rarely flatters tyrants." Tharion's smile held approval that warmed Eleanor more than the time. "Chamber's fireplace. Your great-great-grandmother would have said something very similar. They spent the morning hours working together in comfortable companionship. Eleanor shared her observations about village life under Aldrich's rule, while Tharion provided context from his broader experience with royal governance. She found herself marveling at the depth of his knowledge, not just historical facts, but nuanced understanding of how policies affected real people's lives. When the sun reached its zenith, Tharion excused himself to attend to what he called household matters. Eleanor suspected this referred to his vampiric needs, but felt no urge to pry. Instead, she continued exploring the library, discovering texts on subjects ranging from philosophy to natural science to poetry that revealed the breadth of interests accumulated over centuries. It was while examining a collection of pressed flowers specimens preserved with obvious care between the pages of an herbalist's journal that Eleanor began to understand the profound loneliness that must define immortal existence. Each flower represented a different season, a different year, perhaps even a different decade of solitary study. The careful notation in Tharion's handwriting spoke of someone who had found beauty in small things because he had no one to share larger joys with. When he returned in the afternoon, Eleanor was sitting by the library's window, with her teaching slate balanced on her lap, sketching lesson plans for students she might never see. Again. "Old habits?" Tharion asked gently. "I keep thinking about my children, my students, wondering if anyone is helping young Margaret with her reading now, or if Samuel has found another place where his stutter doesn't matter." Eleanor set the slate aside with a sigh. "It's foolish, I know. They'll adapt. Children always do. It's not foolish to care about the lives you've touched." Tharion settled into a chair across from her. "In my experience, the teachers who worry most about their absent students are the ones who mattered most to those children's development. Do you think they'll remember what I taught them? About thinking for themselves, about questioning what they're told. Children who learn to think don't easily forget the skill, even when circumstances try to discourage them from using it." Tharion's voice carried the certainty of someone who had observed many generations of human development. "The seeds you planted will grow, perhaps not immediately, but eventually." Eleanor felt tears threaten and blinked them back. "I'm sorry. You offer me shelter, and I repay you with melancholy. Grief for lost purposes is not melancholy, it's evidence of a life lived meaningfully." Tharion leaned forward slightly. "Besides, who better to understand such loss than someone who has had to find new purposes repeatedly across the centuries?" As afternoon faded toward evening, Eleanor found herself helping Tharion prepare a simple meal in the fortress's surprisingly well-appointed kitchen. He moved with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to caring for himself, though she noticed he prepared food only for her. "Don't you miss it?" she asked, as she watched him slice bread with professional precision. "Eating, I mean. The pleasure of taste and texture?" "Sometimes," Tharion admitted. "But I've found that what I miss most about mortal experiences is less the physical sensations than the social aspects, sharing meals with friends, the ritual of gathering around a table, the conversations that emerge when people break bread together." Eleanor looked at the carefully prepared plate he set before her, then at the empty space across the table where he would sit without partaking. "Then let's have a conversation," she said firmly. "Tell me about the most memorable meal you shared before your transformation." Tharion's smile was surprised and genuinely pleased. "Now that's a story worth telling," he said, taking his seat across from her. "It was the feast celebrating Marcus's victory over the northern raiders, and the cook had prepared a dish that none of us could identify." As winter darkness settled around the fortress, Eleanor found herself laughing at Tharion's description of confused soldiers, trying to maintain dignity while eating what turned out to be an experimental sauce made with imported spices. For the first time since her exile, she felt the particular warmth that comes from sharing stories with someone who appreciates both their humor and their humanity. The blizzard arrived 3 days after Eleanor's first conversation with Tharion over dinner, sealing them inside the fortress with walls of wind and snow that made the outside world seem like a distant memory. Eleanor woke to the sound of shutters rattling against their frames and windows, completely obscured by drifting white. When she made her way to the great hall, she found Tharion standing before the massive fireplace, staring into flames with an expression she couldn't quite read. "How long do storms like this typically last?" she asked, settling into one of the heavy chairs arranged near the hearth. "This one will likely persist for a week, perhaps longer." Tharion's voice carried no concern, merely the certainty of someone who had witnessed countless winters. "The forest creates its own weather patterns. We're quite secure here. The fortress has weathered far worse." Eleanor studied his profile in the firelight. "But it troubles you nonetheless." Tharion turned to look at her, surprise flickering across his features. "You read expressions well for someone who's known me only a few days. I've spent 15 years watching children try to hide their worries from me. The technique translates surprisingly well to adults." Eleanor pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. "What concerns you about being trapped here together?" For a moment, Tharion seemed to wrestle with how much truth to reveal. When he spoke, his words came carefully measured. "Prolonged isolation affects my kind differently than it does mortals. The hunger becomes more difficult to manage when there are no willing donors within reach, and your presence—" He stopped abruptly. "My presence makes it worse," Eleanor finished for him, "because you can hear my heartbeat, smell my blood, sense all the things that would normally trigger your predatory instincts." Yes. The admission seemed to cost him something. "I have methods of managing the hunger, but they require careful preparation and timing. Being confined disrupts those patterns." Eleanor watched as Tharion moved to a cabinet she hadn't noticed before, and withdrew what appeared to be an ancient sword. The blade was beautiful in its simplicity, no ornate decoration, just perfectly balanced steel that spoke of master craftsmanship. But it was covered in dust, clearly untouched, for some time. "Is that how you used to manage it?" she asked. "Through combat?" "Partly. Action helps burn away the restless energy that accumulates when the hunger builds." Tharion ran his fingers along the blade's edge, testing its sharpness with the automatic precision of someone who had once depended on such weapons for survival. "I was a warrior before I became a scholar. Sometimes the old instincts surface when circumstances become challenging." Eleanor rose from her chair and approached him cautiously. "May I see it?" Tharion hesitated, then offered her the sword, hilt first, with careful control. Eleanor accepted the weapon, immediately surprised by its weight and balance. The sword felt alive in her hands, responsive to the slightest movement. "This is the sword you carried in King Marcus's service," she said, recognizing the quality of workmanship that would have marked a captain's weapon. "The Sword of Mercy," I called it then. It was forged specifically for protecting the innocent rather than seeking conquest. Tharion's voice carried notes of old grief. "I haven't drawn it in anger for over 2 centuries. Why not? Because every time I used it, people died. Even when death was justified, even when it served the greater good, taking lives began to feel like a betrayal of what I was trying to become." Tharion took the sword back from her, holding it with obvious familiarity despite his words. "A vampire who feeds ethically and kills when necessary becomes indistinguishable from one who simply exercises more refined, predatory instincts." Eleanor understood then that she was seeing the heart of Tharion's struggle with his nature. He had chosen to constrain himself, not just in feeding, but in every aspect of his existence that might allow his supernatural abilities to overwhelm his commitment to protecting rather than destroying. "What if there were other ways to burn off that restless energy?" she suggested. "Physical activity that didn't require violence." Tharion looked at her with curiosity. "What did you have in mind? Show me how to use that sword properly." not for combat, but for exercise. You can teach me forms and techniques while working your muscles and reflexes. It would give both of us something constructive to focus on during the storm." The suggestion clearly intrigued him. "You've never held a weapon before today." "No, but I've spent my entire adult life learning new subjects and teaching them to others. I imagine the principles are similar. Start with basics, build gradually, practice until movements become natural." Tharion's smile was the first genuinely amused expression she had seen from him. "Very well. But we start with wooden practice swords. I won't risk injury to my guest while teaching her to fight with steel." The afternoon that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. Tharion proved to be a patient and thorough instructor, breaking down sword work into component movements that could be learned and practiced individually. Eleanor discovered that her years of writing at a blackboard had given her better hand and wrist control than she had realized, and her experience managing unruly students had taught her to maintain balance and spatial awareness even when distracted. More importantly, she saw how the physical activity affected Tharion. The careful restraint that characterized his usual movements gave way to fluid competence as he demonstrated techniques and adjusted her form. His supernatural strength remained controlled, but he seemed to settle into his own body in a way that suggested relief from some persistent tension. "You're a natural at this," he said, after she successfully completed a complex defensive sequence. "Your balance is excellent, and you don't overthink the movements." "I had a good teacher." Eleanor lowered her practice sword, breathing heavily but exhilarated, "though I suspect you've been holding back considerably." "Of course, but the principles remain the same, regardless of the practitioner's strength or speed." Tharion set his own wooden sword aside and moved to check the fire. "How do you feel?" "Tired, but in a good way. Accomplished." Eleanor paused, considering her next words carefully. "How do you feel?" Tharion went still for a moment, as if taking inventory of his internal state. "Better than I have in weeks. The hunger is still present, but it feels manageable rather than overwhelming." He turned to face her with something that might have been surprise. "Thank you. I hadn't realized how much I needed physical release that wasn't tied to violence or feeding." As evening approached and they settled by the fire to share another meal, or rather, for Eleanor to eat while Tharion kept her company, she found herself studying the way firelight played across his features. There was something different about his expression now, a relaxation that hadn't been present before their afternoon of sword work. "Tell me about feeding ethically," she said during a comfortable lull in their conversation. "How do you ensure your donors truly consent?" Tharion looked surprised by her direct approach. Most people avoid asking such questions. Most people don't find themselves sharing extended isolation with a vampire who's struggling with hunger management. "I'd rather understand your needs than accidentally make them worse through ignorance." "The consent must be informed and freely given," Tharion explained carefully. "I seek out those who are already aware of supernatural realities, other immortals, practitioners of magic, scholars of the occult. I explain exactly what I need and what the experience entails. Payment is usually in the form of knowledge, protection, or assistance with their own endeavors. And it sustains you adequately, for the most part. Though the emotional connection involved in feeding makes it more nourishing than simple blood consumption, trust and willingness create a different quality of sustenance than fear or coercion." Eleanor absorbed this information thoughtfully. "That explains why isolation is particularly difficult for your kind. You're cut off from both physical nourishment and the emotional connection that makes it fulfilling." "Precisely." Tharion's voice carried appreciation for her understanding. "Though I confess, your company has provided a different sort of emotional nourishment. Conversation with someone who sees me as a person rather than a monster is sustaining in ways I hadn't anticipated." As the storm continued to rage outside, Eleanor felt something shifting in her perception of their situation. What had begun as temporary shelter was becoming something more complex, a partnership of mutual support between two individuals who understood the cost of maintaining principles in an uncompromising world. The storm finally broke on the seventh day, leaving the fortress buried in snowdrifts that sparkled like scattered diamonds under clear winter sunlight. Eleanor stood at her chamber window, watching the transformed landscape with a mixture of wonder and melancholy. The beauty was undeniable, but she also understood that the clearing weather meant her time in this sanctuary was no longer indefinite. She had been avoiding the mirror in her chamber for days, but this morning she forced herself to confront her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger. Her cheeks had filled out slightly from regular meals, her eyes held a brightness that had been absent since her exile, and there was something in her expression that suggested contentment rather than mere survival. When had she stopped thinking of herself as a refugee and begun feeling at home? The realization troubled her more than it should have. Eleanor had always prided herself on being practical about relationships and circumstances. She formed appropriate attachments to appropriate people and maintained reasonable expectations about outcomes. What she was beginning to feel for Tharion defied every category of appropriate behavior she had ever established for herself. She found him in the library, standing before an ornate mirror that seemed to reflect everything in the room except his own image. The mirror of true sight, he had called it, when showing her the various enchanted objects his long life had accumulated. Eleanor paused in the doorway, struck by the strange sight of seeing her own reflection appear to be alone in the mirror's surface, while Tharion stood clearly visible just beside her. "The storm has passed," she said unnecessarily. "Yes." Tharion didn't turn from the mirror, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. "The roads will be passable again within a few days, once the snow settles. And then I should probably think about moving on." The words felt like ash in her mouth, but Eleanor forced herself to say them. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. Have you decided where you'll go?" The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither seemed willing to address directly. Eleanor moved into the room, her fingers trailing along the spines of books that had become familiar companions over the past week. "I've been thinking about that," she said carefully. "There are other kingdoms, places where King Aldric's influence doesn't reach. I could seek employment as a governess again, or perhaps find a position with a merchant family who values education." "That sounds like a reasonable plan." Tharion's voice was perfectly controlled, revealing nothing of his feelings about her departure. Eleanor stopped before a shelf containing poetry collections, many of them bearing annotations in Tharion's careful script. "These marginal notes, they're beautiful. You write like someone who understands the music behind words. Poetry has been a comfort during the lonelier centuries," Tharion admitted. "Words have a permanence that relationships often lack." She pulled one of the volumes from the shelf, opening to a page marked with a silk ribbon. The poem was about winter, but Tharion's notes revealed layers of meaning about isolation, endurance, and the way beauty could emerge from the harshest circumstances. "You see connections that most readers miss," Eleanor said, genuinely impressed by the depth of his literary analysis. "Have you ever considered that your insights might be worth sharing? You could compile your observations into a scholarly work. Who would publish The Literary Criticism of a Vampire?" Tharion's question carried bitter amusement. "Besides, such work requires dialogue with other scholars, participation in academic communities that would never accept my nature. Not all scholarly exchange requires personal meetings. Correspondence, anonymous submissions, collaborative projects conducted through intermediaries." Eleanor stopped herself, realizing she was essentially proposing that Tharion find ways to engage with the mortal world rather than accepting his isolation. "You think I've given up too easily," he said, finally turning from the mirror to face her directly. I think you've convinced yourself that your nature defines your limitations more than it actually does. Eleanor met his amber gaze steadily. You're brilliant, well-educated, and you have perspectives that could benefit other scholars immensely. Your immortality is an advantage, not just a burden. Tharion moved closer, and Eleanor became acutely aware of the way her pulse quickened when he focused his attention on her completely. And what of you? Have you given up too easily on finding ways to continue teaching? That's different. I was dismissed for refusing to teach falsehoods. Any position I might find would likely come with similar constraints. Not necessarily. Private tutoring, independent schools, families who value truth over political convenience, such opportunities exist for those willing to seek them. Tharion's voice grew softer as he approached. Though finding them might require accepting help from someone with extensive connections and considerable resources, Eleanor felt her breath catch as she understood what he was offering. You would help me establish myself somewhere new. I would do more than that, if you were willing. Tharion stopped, just close enough that she could sense the controlled power in his still form. I could provide backing for a school of your own, a place where children could learn to think rather than simply obey. The possibility hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Eleanor found herself imagining classrooms filled with eager students, libraries stocked with honest texts, discussions that challenged rather than reinforced comfortable assumptions. Why would you make such an offer? She asked quietly. Because in 1 week, you've reminded me why I chose to preserve knowledge and protect innocence rather than simply exist as an apex predator. Tharion's hand rose slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose, before his fingers traced the line of her cheek. Because your passion for education awakens purposes I thought I had lost forever. Eleanor leaned into his touch without conscious decision, her eyes closing as she savored the gentle pressure of his fingers against her skin. When she opened them again, Tharion was watching her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and powerful. This is impossible, she whispered, though her words held no conviction. Many impossible things have proven possible in my experience, Tharion replied. The question is whether you're willing to explore the possibility. Instead of answering with words, Eleanor rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that felt like the first honest decision she had made since arriving at the fortress. Tharion went very still for a heartbeat before his arms came around her, careful and reverent, as if he were holding something precious that might disappear at any moment. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the absence of a heartbeat that should have disturbed her, but somehow didn't. I don't know how this could work, she said against the fabric of his shirt. Neither do I, Tharion admitted, his voice rumbling through his chest. But I know I don't want you to leave. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Outside, winter sunlight streamed through the library, windows illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. Eleanor understood that she stood at a crossroads where every choice would fundamentally alter the course of her remaining years. The safe path lay in leaving as planned, seeking ordinary employment in distant lands where her past couldn't follow. The impossible path offered love, purpose, and partnership with a man who understood the value of knowledge and the cost of principles, but also required accepting a relationship that defied every social convention she had ever known. As Tharion's hands framed her face with infinite gentleness, Eleanor realized her choice had already been made. Some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was a lifetime of wondering what might have been possible. The days following their first kiss passed in a strange suspension of reality, as if the fortress existed outside the normal flow of time. Eleanor found herself moving through familiar routines, reading in the library, sharing meals, practicing sword forms with Tharion, while simultaneously navigating the entirely new territory of loving someone whose very existence challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. It was in the castle's highest tower that she discovered the eternal rose. Tharion had shown her to this chamber almost apologetically, explaining that it contained reminders of other times that might seem melancholy to mortal sensibilities. But Eleanor found the collection fascinating, rather than morbid, artifacts from across centuries, arranged with the care of someone who understood the weight of memory. The rose sat in a place of honor near the tower's eastern window, preserved within a glass dome that seemed to shimmer with its own light. The flower was beautiful beyond description, its petals holding depths of color that shifted from deep crimson to gold to silver as Eleanor moved around it. Yet, something about its perfection felt incomplete, as if it existed in a state of permanent anticipation. "It's been like this for over 300 years, Tharion said from behind her, his voice carrying notes of old sadness. A gift from someone who thought eternal preservation was preferable to natural cycles of growth and decay. But it will never fully bloom, Eleanor observed, understanding instinctively what made the rose seem so poignant. It's trapped between states, neither growing nor dying, but unable to achieve its full potential. Precisely. Tharion joined her before the dome, his reflection absent from the glass surface that clearly showed Eleanor's fascination. I've sometimes wondered if it's meant to be a metaphor for immortal existence, endless duration without the possibility of completion. Eleanor studied his profile, noting the way twilight emphasized the elegant lines of his face. Do you feel that way about your own existence? Suspended rather than truly living? I did, until recently. Tharion's gaze met, hers in the glass dome's surface where only her eyes were visible. Now I find myself wondering if the rose's preservation might serve a different purpose, waiting for the right moment to fulfill its destiny. The conversation continued as they made their way back to the main living areas of the fortress. But Eleanor found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the image of the eternal rose. There was something about its suspended state that felt relevant to her own situation, though she couldn't quite articulate the connection. Spring's approach had become undeniable, despite the lingering snow. Longer days brought increased light streaming through the fortress windows, and Eleanor occasionally heard the distant sound of ice cracking as winter's grip began to loosen. With each passing day, the question of her future became more pressing, though neither she nor Tharion seemed willing to address it directly. Instead, they found themselves drawn into increasingly intimate conversations that revealed layers of personality and experience neither had shared with anyone in decades. Eleanor learned about Tharion's struggles with the ethical implications of immortality, the way outliving everyone he cared about had led him to avoid forming deep connections, and how his vampire nature created a constant tension between his desire to protect and his capacity to destroy. In return, she shared her own struggles with purpose and belonging. The teaching career that had defined her adult life was over, not just because of her exile, but because the education system itself had become corrupted beyond her ability to work within it. At 53, she faced the prospect of reinventing herself completely, with no clear idea of what form that reinvention might take. You speak as if your teaching years were a complete chapter that's now closed, Tharion observed one evening as they sat before the great hall's fireplace. But knowledge and the ability to share it don't disappear simply because circumstances change. True, but finding appropriate outlets becomes considerably more challenging when one is branded as a corrupting influence by royal decree. Eleanor pulled her shawl closer, though the fire provided adequate warmth. I've been thinking about your suggestion of establishing a school, but the practical obstacles seem overwhelming. Which obstacles concern you most? Eleanor counted off on her fingers. Funding, location, attracting families willing to risk royal displeasure, finding other teachers who share similar educational philosophies, protecting students and staff from potential retaliation, all solvable problems for someone with sufficient resources and connections. Tharion interrupted gently. though I understand if the risks feel too substantial to justify the attempt. It's not the risks that concern me most, Eleanor admitted after a long pause. It's the question of whether I have the right to involve others in something that might ultimately serve my own needs more than theirs. Tharion leaned forward in his chair, amber eyes reflecting firelight. Explain. Staying here, working with you to establish a school, building something together, it's what I want, Tharion. More than I've wanted anything in years. But wanting something so desperately makes it difficult to evaluate whether it's truly the right choice or simply the most appealing one. The honesty of her admission hung between them like a challenge. Tharion was quiet for several moments, staring into the fire with an expression that suggested he was weighing his words carefully. I've lived long enough to learn the difference between wants that serve only oneself and wants that serve larger purposes, he said finally. Your desire to continue teaching, to create an environment where young minds can flourish these wants, align with the greater good, regardless of the personal satisfaction they might bring you. And my desire to stay here with you, how does that serve anyone beyond ourselves? Tharion's smile was soft and slightly sad. Perhaps the question isn't whether our happiness serves others, but whether denying it serves anyone at all. You've spent your entire adult life prioritizing duty over desire. Would it truly be selfish to make one choice based primarily on what brings you joy? Eleanor felt tears threaten, though she wasn't sure if they came from relief, fear, or simply the overwhelming nature of contemplating such a fundamental shift in how she approached life decisions. I don't know how to be in love with a vampire, she whispered. I don't know how to love someone who will age and die while I remain unchanged, Tharion replied, his voice equally quiet. But I know that avoiding the attempt because it's difficult guarantees we'll never discover what might be possible. Rising from his chair, Tharion moved to kneel beside Eleanor's seat, taking her hands in his with the careful gentleness she had come to associate with his every interaction with her. Stay, he said simply, not because it's practical or safe or easily explained to others. Stay because you want to stay. Because what we're building together has value that extends beyond either of our individual needs. Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, her mortal fingers intertwined with those of someone who had existed for over a millennium. The contrast should have emphasized their differences, but instead it highlighted how naturally they fit together despite the impossibility of their circumstances. I'll stay, she said, the words carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape everything about her remaining years. At least, until we see what blooms from what we're planting together. Outside, the first tentative sounds of spring began to emerge as winter loosened its hold on the forest. But within the fortress, Eleanor felt as if she and Tharion existed in their own. Season 1, defined not by external cycles, but by the gradual unfolding of something that had never existed before and might never exist again. Eleanor woke to the sound of horses in the distance and Tharion's urgent voice calling her name. Dawn light filtered through her chamber windows, revealing his tense figure standing beside her bed with an expression that made her blood run cold. "We have visitors," he said without preamble. "Royal soldiers, by the look of their banners. They've made camp at the forest's edge and sent scouts into the trees." Eleanor sat up quickly, her mind immediately racing through possibilities. How many? Perhaps 30 men. Too many for a routine patrol, but not enough for a full military campaign. Tharion moved to her window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. They're methodical in their search pattern, as if looking for something specific rather than conducting random enforcement. "They're looking for me," Eleanor said with certainty that surprised her. "But how could they know I'm here? I've been careful to leave no trace of my passage through the forest." Tharion's jaw tightened. "Unless they had reason to search these woods specifically. Eleanor, is there anything about your exile that you haven't told me?" Anything that might explain why King Aldrich would commit significant resources to tracking down a dismissed teacher? Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I don't understand what you're asking. Royal hunting parties don't pursue common criminals into the Forest of Whispers. The cost in men and materials would be prohibitive unless the target held unusual value. Tharion turned from the window to face her fully. What was your father's name? The question seemed to come from nowhere, hitting Eleanor like a physical blow. My father? He died when I was very young. He was a scholar, a historian. His name? Tharion pressed gently but firmly. Marcus Whitmore. Eleanor frowned, unsettled by the intensity of Tharion's reaction to the information. Why does that matter? Tharion went completely still, his expression cycling through shock, recognition, and something that might have been dawning horror. Marcus Whitmore, author of The True Chronicle of Royal Succession and Concerning the Rights of Common Folk. A scholar whose writings questioned the legitimacy of King Aldrich's grandfather's claim to the throne. Yes, that sounds right, though I was too young when he died to really understand his work. Eleanor climbed out of bed, reaching for her dress with hands that had begun to tremble. Tharion, you're frightening me. What does my father's scholarship have to do with soldiers searching for me now? Your father wasn't just a scholar, Eleanor. Tharion's voice carried the weight of someone delivering devastating news. He was the intellectual foundation of the rebellion that nearly toppled the royal house 40 years ago. His writings provided the legal and historical justification for deposing illegitimate rulers. Eleanor's legs gave way, and she sank onto the edge of her bed as the implications washed over her. That's impossible. My father was a quiet man who loved books. My mother always said he died of a fever. He was executed for treason, Tharion said gently, along with dozens of other rebellion leaders. Your mother fled with you to the countryside, changed your family name, and created a new history to protect you from royal retribution. The chamber seemed to spin around Eleanor as memories rearranged themselves in light of this revelation. Her mother's nervous reactions to royal proclamations, the way certain topics made her go quiet and watchful, the family's abrupt move to Millbrook when Eleanor was 7 years old, all of it suddenly made terrible sense. How do you know this? Eleanor asked weakly. Because I was there when your father was captured. Tharion's voice carried old pain. I was serving as an intelligence gatherer for King Marcus during the rebellion. Your father's writings had inspired me to question whether the current royal line truly deserved the loyalty I had given it for centuries. Eleanor stared at him, feeling as if the man she had fallen in love with was transforming before her eyes into someone she didn't recognize. You knew who I was from the moment you found me in the forest. I suspected, but I wasn't certain until this conversation. Tharion moved closer, his hands extended in a gesture of appeal. Eleanor, please understand. I couldn't have protected your father then, but I've spent 4 decades watching for any sign that his family had survived. When I saw you in the woods, carrying yourself with his exact bearing and defending principles he would have died for, he did die for them, apparently. Eleanor felt anger building alongside her shock. And you let me believe my exile was a coincidence. That our meeting was chance, rather, than you fulfilling some misguided sense of obligation. It wasn't obligation, Tharion said firmly. Yes, I felt responsible for failing to protect your father. Yes, I was drawn to help you, partly because of that history. But everything that developed between us afterward, the conversations, the companionship, the love, none of that was tainted by the past. Eleanor stood abruptly, pacing to the window where she could see smoke rising from the soldiers' camp. Those men aren't just hunting for a disgraced teacher. They're hunting for the daughter of Marcus Whitmore, aren't they? The last living heir to the rebellion's intellectual legacy. Most likely. Tharion joined her at the window, his presence both comforting and complicated by her new understanding of their connection. Your teaching methods, your refusal to compromise on historical truth, your willingness to challenge royal authority, you've been displaying exactly the kind of independent thinking that made your father dangerous to the crown. So King Aldrich decided to eliminate the problem before it could grow into something larger. Eleanor laughed bitterly. I thought I was being persecuted for my principles. Instead, I was being targeted because of my bloodline. A new sound from outside drew their attention, horses moving closer to the fortress, accompanied by the clink of armor and weapons. Tharion's expression hardened into something Eleanor had never seen before, predatory focus that reminded her exactly what kind of creature he was beneath his scholarly exterior. "They've found the fortress," he said grimly. "We have perhaps an hour before they organize an assault." "Can you fight 30 soldiers?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "I can, but doing so would require abandoning every principle I've maintained for centuries about avoiding unnecessary killing." Tharion turned to face her, amber eyes glowing with suppressed power. "There is another option, though it would require trust and courage from you that I have no right to ask for." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Tell me. I can offer you what I offered no one else in over 1,000 years of existence, the chance to become what I am. Immortal, powerful enough to defend yourself against any mortal threat, free from the vulnerabilities that make you a target for kings and soldiers." The offer hung between them like a chasm that, once crossed, could never be recrossed. Eleanor understood that he was proposing not just her transformation, but the complete abandonment of her human life and all the connections that still tied her to the mortal world. "The transformation," she said carefully, "what would it cost? Everything you are now dies to make room for what you would become. Your mortal body, your human limitations, your connection to the natural cycles of life and death, all of it would be replaced by something fundamentally different." Eleanor looked out at the boat, soldiers preparing to storm the fortress, then back at Tharion's face, reading the mix of hope and terror in his expression. He wanted her to choose transformation, but he also understood exactly what he was asking her to sacrifice. Would I still be myself? Would I still care about teaching, about truth, about the things that have defined my life? Your core personality would remain, but enhanced and shifted by immortal perspective. You would still value knowledge and justice, but you might pursue them through methods that would seem impossible or unthinkable to your current self. The sound of armor grew closer, and Eleanor heard voices calling orders as the soldiers organized their approach. Decision time was running out, and she understood that whatever choice she made would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who might be touched by what she and Tharion could accomplish together. "There's a third option," she said suddenly, an idea crystallizing as she spoke. "What if we don't fight them or flee from them? What if we convince them that Eleanor Whitmore is not the threat they believe her to be?" Tharion looked intrigued despite the urgency of their situation. "How?" "By giving them something more valuable than my capture information that serves the kingdom's interests while protecting our sanctuary here." Eleanor smiled grimly. "My father may have been a rebel, but I'm just a teacher who's learned to think strategically about protecting what matters most." Eleanor's mind raced as she heard the soldiers drawing closer to the fortress. Her proposal to negotiate rather than fight had surprised even herself, but as she considered their options, it seemed like the only path that didn't require either devastating violence or her immediate transformation into something beyond human understanding. "You want to parley with them," Tharion said, his tone suggesting he found the idea both admirable and potentially suicidal. "Eleanor, these are King Aldrich's men. They're not known for their willingness to engage in philosophical discussions with wanted rebels. They're not here to capture a rebel," Eleanor corrected, moving away from the window to begin pacing the chamber as she thought through possibilities. "They're here to eliminate a potential threat before it becomes actual opposition." If we can demonstrate that I pose no danger to the crown, better yet, that I might be useful to royal interests, they might be willing to negotiate." Tharion watched her pace with something between admiration and concern. "And how do you propose to convince them of your usefulness while simultaneously protecting our sanctuary?" Eleanor paused in her movement, turning to face him with growing certainty. "By offering them something they want more than my death, accurate intelligence about the real threats facing the kingdom." "Explain. You've lived here for centuries, observing the political changes, watching different rulers come and go. You understand the patterns that repeat themselves across generations." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as her plan took shape. "What if we offered the crown access to that knowledge? Historical perspective that could help them identify genuine threats before they become rebellions?" Tharion's expression shifted as he grasped the implications. "You're suggesting we position ourselves as resources rather than threats." "Exactly. My father's writings may have inspired rebellion 40 years ago, but those same analytical skills could serve the crown's stability if properly channeled." Eleanor moved to her small bag and withdrew the teaching slate she had carried through her exile. "I need to write a proposal, something that demonstrates value while establishing our terms for cooperation." "Eleanor," Tharion's voice carried warning, "even if they accept such an arrangement, it would mean compromising the principles that led to your exile in the first place. Are you prepared to serve a king whose methods you despise?" The question struck at the heart of her moral foundation, and Eleanor felt the weight of choosing between survival and integrity. But as she considered their circumstances, a different possibility emerged. What if we're not compromising our principles so much as finding a more effective way to serve them? She asked slowly. "My father fought the crown directly and was executed for it. His rebellion failed, and 40 years later, the kingdom is more oppressive than ever. Perhaps direct confrontation isn't the most effective approach to creating change." She moved to the small writing desk in her chamber, pulling out ink and parchment to begin drafting her proposal. "Instead of opposing royal authority, what if we worked to influence it? Shape it gradually toward more just policies through careful counsel and historical insight?" Tharion joined her at the desk, reading over her shoulder as she wrote, "That's a dangerous game, Eleanor. Court politics have destroyed many who thought they could reform the system from within." "All paths are dangerous now," Eleanor replied, her pen moving steadily across the parchment. "But this one offers the possibility of protecting not just ourselves, but eventually creating the kind of educational opportunities I've dreamed of, with royal backing rather than royal opposition." As she worked, Eleanor found herself thinking of the transformation elixir Tharion had mentioned earlier. In her chamber's wardrobe, hidden behind her few spare garments, sat a small crystal vial he had given her that morning, for emergency use only. The transformation elixir, a mystical potion that could grant her immortality but would require the willing sacrifice of her mortal life. The vial seemed to pulse with its own inner light, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Eleanor had been avoiding looking at it directly, but now she forced herself to confront the choice it represented. If their negotiation with the soldiers failed, if violence became inevitable, she could drink the elixir and face whatever came as Tharion's immortal equal, rather than his vulnerable human companion. "Tell me about the transformation process," she said without looking up from her writing. "If I were to choose it, what would I experience?" Tharion went very still beside her. "Are you seriously considering it?" "I'm considering all our options. The elixir represents a path forward that ensures I could never again be threatened by mortal kings or their soldiers. But I need to understand what I would be sacrificing to gain that security." Tharion was quiet for several moments before answering. "The physical transformation takes several hours and is extremely painful. Your body essentially dies and is reborn according to different natural laws. During that time, you would be completely helpless. I would need to protect you while your human form was replaced by something immortal, and afterward, you would possess strength, speed, and sensory capabilities far beyond human limits. You would need blood for sustenance, though, as my companion, you would learn ethical feeding practices from the beginning. Most importantly, you would have unlimited time to pursue whatever purposes you chose, teaching, scholarship, protecting others, without the constraints of a single mortal lifetime. Eleanor's pen paused in its movement across the parchment. Would we be equals then? True partners rather than protector and protected? More than equals, Tharion said softly. Immortal companions who chose each other freely and could build something together across centuries rather than mere decades. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted their conversation. Eleanor quickly folded her proposal and tucked it into her dress, while Tharion moved to listen at the chamber door. "They're in the fortress," he said grimly, moving systematically through the lower levels. "We have perhaps 20 minutes before they reach this floor." Eleanor stood and moved to the wardrobe, retrieving the transformation elixir with hands that trembled only slightly. The vial felt warm against her palm, as if it contained liquid starlight rather than an alchemical compound. "If I drink this now, would the transformation be complete before they find us?" "No. You would be in the most vulnerable stage of the process when they arrived." Tharion's amber eyes reflected his internal struggle. "Eleanor, I won't let them harm you regardless of which choice you make, but the decision about your mortality must be yours alone." Eleanor nodded, understanding the weight of what he was saying. She tucked the vial into the pocket of her dress, where it rested against her hip like a promise of possibilities she couldn't quite imagine. "Then we try negotiation first," she decided. "If it fails, if violence becomes unavoidable, I'll make the choice that gives us the best chance of survival and success." They spent the remaining time preparing for confrontation. Tharion retrieved weapons from various hiding places throughout the chamber, not just his ancient sword, but also crossbow bolts, throwing knives, and other implements that spoke of his long experience with mortal combat. Eleanor watched him transform from scholarly companion to deadly predator, understanding for the first time the true extent of the power he had kept carefully controlled in her presence. "Remember," he said as he secured a knife to his belt, "if negotiation fails and violence begins, stay behind me until you decide about the elixir. Don't try to help fight your mortal reflexes, will only put you in more danger. And if I choose transformation during the battle, find a defensible position, drink the elixir, and survive long enough for me to protect you through the change." Tharion's expression was grim but determined. "I've waited 1,000 years for a companion worthy of immortality. I won't lose you to mortal soldiers and their limited understanding." The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by voices calling orders and the sound of doors being forced open as the soldiers searched each chamber systematically. Eleanor felt her heart racing as she realized that everything she had become over the past weeks, scholar, lover, partner to an immortal, was about to be tested in ways she couldn't have imagined when she first fled into the Forest of Whispers. "Whatever happens," she said to Tharion, reaching for his hand, "I want you to know that finding you, learning to love you, has been the most meaningful experience of my life. If I don't survive this unchanged, if I become something different through transformation, or if I die defending our sanctuary, I need you to remember that these weeks have been worth any cost." Tharion raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "You won't die, Eleanor Whitmore. Whether you remain mortal or choose immortality, you'll live to see our love flourish and our purposes served. I promise you that." Outside her chamber door, heavy boots stopped directly in the corridor. Eleanor heard the rasp of drawn steel and the low murmur of soldiers positioning themselves for entry. Her fingers found the transformation elixir in her pocket, while her other hand gripped the folded proposal that represented their hope for peaceful resolution. Time had run out for preparation. Now came the moment when all their choices would be tested against the unforgiving reality of royal soldiers who had travelled far to eliminate a threat they didn't understand and might not be willing to negotiate away. The chamber door exploded inward with a crash that shook dust from the ancient stones. 6 soldiers poured through the opening, their armour gleaming in the morning light and their weapons drawn with professional efficiency. Eleanor felt time slow as she took in details that would have been invisible moments before the captain's scarred face beneath his helm, the way the younger soldiers hung back while their leader assessed the situation, the particular quality of tension that preceded violence. But what struck her most was how the soldiers reacted when they saw Tharion. The captain's eyes widened with recognition that seemed to span decades, and his sword wavered as if he were seeing a ghost rather than an enemy. "Lord Tharion," the captain said, his voice carrying disbelief and something that might have been reverence. "Is it truly you?" Tharion straightened to his full height, and Eleanor saw him assume a bearing of authority she had never witnessed before. When he spoke, his voice carried the command presence of someone who had once led armies, rather than simply defended knowledge. "Captain Aldrich," Tharion replied with formal courtesy. "You've aged since last we met. I trust your family prospers." "My lord, yes, they do well, thanks to Besant, your intervention all those years ago." The captain's weapon lowered completely, though his men remained ready for action. "But you're supposed to be dead. The records show your death nearly 3 centuries ago. The records show many things that serve political convenience rather than truth," Tharion said calmly. "As does my presence here today, serving my oath to protect the innocent and preserve knowledge for future generations." Eleanor watched this exchange with growing amazement. Whatever history existed between Tharion and this soldier was clearly more complex than simple recognition. The captain looked genuinely conflicted, torn between duty and obvious respect for the vampire before him. "We're here for the woman," Captain Aldrich said finally. "Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of the traitor Marcus. Our orders are to bring her back for questioning about seditious activities, and if she chooses not to accompany you—" Tharion's voice carried subtle threat that made the younger soldiers shift nervously. "Then we're authorized to use whatever force is necessary." The captain's tone suggested he found those orders distasteful. "Lord Tharion, surely you understand we cannot ignore royal commands, regardless of personal sentiments." Eleanor stepped forward, drawing all attention to herself. "Captain, before violence becomes necessary, would you be willing to hear a proposal that might serve the Crown's interests better than my capture?" The captain's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, clearly looking for resemblances to her father. "What manner of proposal?" Eleanor withdrew the folded parchment from her dress, holding it up where the soldiers could see it clearly. "An offer to serve the kingdom's stability through knowledge, rather than oppose it through ignorance. My father's rebellion failed because it relied on force rather than understanding. I propose a different approach." "Explain," Captain Aldrich said, though his posture remained ready for sudden action. "King Aldrich faces threats. He doesn't fully comprehend political movements brewing in distant provinces, economic pressures that could destabilize the realm, neighboring kingdoms that probe for weaknesses." Eleanor spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent her life analyzing complex systems. What if the Crown had access to historical perspective that could identify such threats before they became crises? The captain glanced at Tharion, clearly recognizing the vampire's potential value as a source of long-term intelligence. "Continue. I offer my skills as an analyst and Lord Tharion's knowledge as a historian, in service to royal interests, not as prisoners or unwilling subjects, but as voluntary advisors who understand the cost of instability and prefer gradual reform to violent revolution." Captain Aldrich considered this for several moments, while his men waited with obvious tension. Eleanor could see him weighing personal loyalty against duty, immediate orders against long-term strategic value. "The king wants you dead or captured," he said finally. "Your proposal assumes he values counsel more than elimination of potential threats." "Then test the assumption," Eleanor replied boldly. "Return to court with my proposal rather than my body. If King Aldrich rejects the offer, you can always return to complete your original mission." It was then that the situation shifted dramatically. One of the younger soldiers, apparently impatient with diplomacy, stepped forward with his crossbow raised toward Eleanor. "Enough talking," he snarled. "The woman dies here, and we take her head back as proof. No need to complicate matters with political games." Time seemed to fracture. Eleanor saw Tharion begin to move with inhuman speed, his careful restraint finally breaking as someone threatened her life directly. She saw Captain Aldrich turn toward his subordinate with obvious alarm, recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his control. And she felt her hand close around the transformation elixir in her pocket. The young soldier's finger tightened on the crossbow trigger just as Tharion's sword cleared its scabbard. Eleanor understood with crystalline clarity that the next few seconds would determine not just her fate, but the entire future she and Tharion might build together. Without conscious thought, she pulled the elixir from her pocket and raised it toward her lips, making the choice that would change everything about what she was and what she might become. The transformation elixir burned like liquid fire as it passed Eleanor's lips, but she forced herself to drink every drop while chaos erupted around her. The young soldier's crossbow bolt whistled past her ear as Tharion's blade severed the weapon's string with impossible precision. Captain Aldrich was shouting orders to restore discipline, but his men had already drawn their weapons, responding to what they perceived as an attack on their comrade. Eleanor felt the elixir racing through her bloodstream like molten gold, rewriting everything about her physical existence at the cellular level. The pain was extraordinary. Every nerve ending seemed to catch fire simultaneously, while her heart hammered against her ribs with rhythms that defied natural law. "Eleanor!" Tharion's voice cut through the sounds of combat as he engaged 3 soldiers simultaneously, his ancient sword moving in patterns too fast for mortal eyes to follow. "Find cover, the change has begun." But Eleanor discovered that finding cover was no longer necessary. The crown of rebirth materialized around her temples, a circlet of silver light that marked her transformation into something beyond mortal vulnerability. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual dust motes floating in the air, track the trajectory of every weapon, and read the micro-expressions that revealed each soldier's intentions before they acted on them. The young soldier, who had tried to kill her, was reaching for a backup crossbow when Eleanor moved. She crossed the chamber in what felt like a single step, her new strength allowing her to grip his wrist and apply just enough pressure to make him drop the weapon without breaking bones. "I don't want to hurt you," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't existed moments before. "But I won't allow you to threaten what I've chosen to protect." The soldier stared at her with terror and confusion, clearly recognizing that the woman he had tried to execute was no longer entirely human. Behind them, Tharion had disarmed the remaining attackers without killing any of them, though his message about his capabilities was unmistakably clear. Captain Aldrich stood in the center of the chaos, with his own sword lowered, studying Eleanor's transformed appearance with the analytical mind of a veteran soldier. "You chose immortality," he said, and his tone carried respect rather than horror. "I chose partnership," Eleanor corrected, releasing the young soldier's wrist and stepping back to stand beside Tharion. "The immortality is simply the means to that end." She could feel the transformation completing itself throughout her body muscles, restructuring themselves for supernatural strength, senses expanding to encompass information she had never imagined, and most remarkably, a growing awareness of Tharion's presence that felt like having part of her soul residing outside her own body. "The proposal still stands," Eleanor continued, addressing Captain Aldrich while keeping her enhanced senses alert to the movements of his men. though I suspect our negotiating position has improved somewhat." Tharion moved to stand beside her, and Eleanor felt their new connection settle into place, like puzzle pieces that had finally found their proper configuration. The vampire who had once stood alone for centuries now had an immortal companion who could match his strength and share his purposes. "Your king sent you to eliminate a threat," Tharion said to the captain, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had once commanded armies. "Instead, you've witnessed the birth of an alliance that could serve the crown's interests for centuries to come, or oppose them with capabilities he cannot imagine." Captain Aldrich studied them both for a long moment before addressing his men. "Lower your weapons. We're no longer dealing with a situation that can be resolved through force." The young soldier who had precipitated the violence looked confused. "Sir, our orders were clear. Our orders were based on incomplete intelligence," the captain replied firmly. "Circumstances have changed, and we must adapt accordingly." He turned back to Eleanor and Tharion. "What exactly are you proposing?" Eleanor felt her new immortal clarity, organizing thoughts and possibilities with crystalline precision. "An alliance of mutual benefit. We offer the crown access to historical knowledge, analytical capabilities, and supernatural resources that no other advisors could provide. In return, we receive legitimacy, protection for our sanctuary, and the freedom to pursue educational projects that serve the kingdom's long-term interests. And if the king rejects this alliance, then he faces opponents who understand his weaknesses better than he understands ours," Eleanor replied calmly. "But I believe King Aldrich is pragmatic enough to recognize an opportunity when presented with one." Tharion smiled at her response, and Eleanor felt his approval through their new bond, like warmth spreading through her transformed body. They were no longer protector and protected, or even mortal and immortal lovers navigating impossible circumstances. They were partners in the truest sense, equals who could build something together that neither could have achieved alone. "Take our proposal to the king," Tharion said to Captain Aldrich. "Tell him that Eleanor Whitmore lives, but not as the threat he imagined. She has become something far more valuable, a bridge between mortal concerns and immortal perspective, dedicated to serving wisdom rather than pursuing power." The captain nodded slowly, clearly recognizing the shift in dynamics that made further violence both unnecessary and inadvisable. "I'll carry your words to court," he said, "though I'll also need to report on what I've witnessed here today." "Report truthfully," Eleanor replied. "The crown deserves to understand exactly what they're choosing to ally with or oppose." As the soldiers prepared to withdraw from the fortress, Eleanor felt the final stages of her transformation settling into equilibrium. She was no longer the exiled teacher who had stumbled into these woods seeking shelter. She had become something new, immortal, powerful, and bound by love to a partner who could help her explore possibilities that stretched across centuries rather than mere decades. 6 months after the soldiers departed with their proposal, Eleanor stood in the courtyard of what had once been Tharion's fortress and was now their shared academy. The spring air carried the laughter of children, 12 young students whose families had risked royal displeasure to seek education that prioritized truth over political convenience. Behind her, the sound of construction echoed through the forest as workers expanded the facility under Tharion's careful supervision. The new history book lay open on the stone table before her, its pages covered with her careful script documenting the real events shaping their kingdom. Unlike the sanitized chronicles produced for royal consumption, this volume recorded the experiences of common families, the effects of policies on actual lives, and the patterns that repeated themselves across generations. It was the work her father had begun, continued with the perspective that only immortal observation could provide. King Aldrich had accepted their proposal, though not without reservations. Eleanor's transformation had convinced him that elimination was no longer a practical option, and Captain Aldrich's report had emphasized the strategic value of their historical knowledge. The resulting agreement was complex. They would provide intelligence and analysis to the Crown in exchange for legal protection and the right to establish their educational sanctuary. The arrangement was far from perfect. King Aldrich remained suspicious of their motives, and many nobles viewed their academy with open hostility. But it represented something Eleanor had never dared imagine when she first fled into the Forest of Whispers, the possibility of serving both truth and stability without compromising either principle. "How do the new students adapt to their unusual teachers?" Tharion asked, joining her in the courtyard with the quiet grace that had become even more pronounced since her transformation. Their immortal bond allowed them to sense each other's presence across great distances, but Eleanor still treasured the simple pleasure of his company during quiet moments. "Better than I expected," Eleanor replied, closing the history book and turning to face him fully. "They're curious about our nature rather than frightened, and they seem to understand that knowledge itself is more important than the conventional backgrounds of those who share it. And their families, grateful enough for quality education that they're willing to overlook the supernatural aspects of our curriculum." Eleanor smiled, remembering young Margaret's excitement when she had discovered their library contained texts no other school could offer. "Though I suspect some parents tell themselves we're simply very dedicated scholars with unusual living arrangements." Tharion laughed, the sound carrying warmth that would have been impossible during his centuries of solitary existence. "Let them maintain their comfortable delusions as long as their children receive the education they deserve." They walked together toward the expanded library, passing windows where students could be seen bent over their studies or engaged in animated discussions with the other teachers they had recruited, carefully selected scholars who shared their commitment to honest education and could be trusted with the truth about their host's nature. "Any word from the capital about our latest intelligence report?" Eleanor asked. "Captain Aldrich sent a coded message yesterday. Our warnings about the northern provinces proved accurate. There were indeed seditious meetings planned, but the king's agents were able to prevent them from developing into actual rebellion." Tharion's expression grew thoughtful. "Aldrich may not trust our motives, but he's beginning to appreciate the practical value of our analysis." Eleanor nodded, understanding that their relationship with the Crown would likely always remain complicated. They served royal interests when those interests aligned with broader stability and justice, but their immortal perspective made them poor candidates for blind loyalty to any particular ruler. In the library, they found their oldest student working late over a translation of classical texts, a brilliant girl whose hunger for knowledge reminded Eleanor powerfully of her own younger self. The sight filled her with satisfaction that had become one of the unexpected pleasures of immortal existence. The knowledge that she could continue teaching for centuries rather than mere decades, watching countless students discover their own capacity for learning and growth. "We should write to some of my former students," Eleanor said, as they settled into their favorite chairs beside the great fireplace. "The ones who are old enough now to understand what really happened when I left Millbrook. Are you ready for those conversations?" Tharion asked gently. "Explaining your transformation to people who knew you as mortal?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. Her enhanced senses could detect nuances in his concern that she would have missed as a human. He worried that reconnecting with her mortal past might cause her to regret the choices that had led to their current happiness. "I think I am," she said finally, "not to reveal everything about our nature, obviously, but to let them know that their old teacher survived her exile and found ways to continue serving the purposes they helped her discover." Outside, evening was settling over the Forest of Whispers, but the Academy's windows glowed with warm light that welcomed any traveler who might seek shelter and learning. Eleanor had come to understand that their sanctuary served a purpose larger than either education or romance. It represented proof that exiles could create new forms of belonging that love could transcend the boundaries of mortality, and that some alliances made both participants stronger than they could have been alone. "Do you ever miss it?" Tharion asked, echoing a question she had posed to him months earlier about mortal pleasures. The simplicity of human existence, the comfort of natural limitations. Eleanor reached for his hand, marveling as she always did at how perfectly their transformed natures complemented each other. "I miss some things," she admitted. "The particular poignancy that comes from knowing time is limited, the way mortality made every moment feel precious because it could be lost. But I don't miss the fear, or the helplessness, or the knowledge that death would eventually separate us." Eleanor smiled, feeling the contentment that had become her default emotional state since accepting immortality. "I prefer having unlimited time to explore what we can build together." As night deepened around their sanctuary, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate exile to eternal partnership. She had lost her mortal life and gained something far more. Valuable purpose that could expand across centuries, love that transcended natural limitations, and the opportunity to serve truth in ways her younger self had never imagined possible. The transformation had cost her everything she was, to make room for everything she could become. It was, Eleanor thought as she watched firelight play across Tharion's features, the best bargain she had ever made.